From TAGTV in Canada, welcome to Panorama. I'm your hostess, Gada Hamadani. Canada has been a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, since its inception in 1949, and was one of the principal initiators of the alliance. Today, we'll shed light on the role of NATO in Middle East and specifically in Iraq. I'd like to welcome my guest, Robert Baines, the President of NATO Association in Canada. Welcome, Robert.
Hello, Gala. A pleasure to be here.
Thank you for coming, actually.
Yeah.
Okay, what is the NATO Association of Canada and, it's like how it operates?
Sure. So the first thing you should know about the NATO Association of Canada is that it is an educational charity. Our job is to make sure that Canadians in general know what NATO is. And a lot of your viewers might not really know what it is at its basis. So allow me to just explain it a little bit. After the Second World War, Canada and a number of other nations got together because they realized that the way things were working in the 1920s and 1930s, where countries were competing with one another and they had independent treaties with one another of friendship or economic trade, that this wasn't the best way of working, because when you work independently with different nations, bigger nations can gang up on smaller ones. That's how the Second World War essentially started. And pertinent to today, that's kind of what Donald Trump wants to do as well, unfortunately, is to have countries that are stronger have more power in the international order. So after the Second World War, we realized, with millions dead and billions of dollars lost to destruction, that this wasn't the way that the world should work anymore, that there should be international organizations helping to maintain peace and security. So that's the time when you see the beginnings of the United Nations, of NATO itself, the beginnings of the World Bank, and many other organizations that were meant to produce justice internationally. Whether they did or not is, of course, a case-by-case basis. But the idea was to maintain a situation where justice ruled. And the United States was very interested in that situation. But the most genius of all of the international organizations is probably NATO. I'm, of course, somewhat biased in this, but NATO is the simple idea that countries get together, sign up to an agreement whereby if one of them is attacked, all of them will act as if they are attacked. So somewhat like the Three Musketeers, an attack upon one is an attack upon all. And that is the most important aspect of NATO, because that is what is supposed to be creating the environment for peace. Nobody wants to start a fight if you know that you're going to have 20 of your friends behind you if they throw the first punch. So that is the whole basis of NATO, is that it's peace through strength, that you train with your allies to make sure that you're ready to give a credible deterrence. That's what they call it, a deterrence to anybody who thinks that they might want to start a fight with you. Seeing as that's kind of how the Second World War started, people being picked off one by one, it's rather a revolutionary idea, and it's one that Canada was part of at the beginning. So my job is to make sure that Canadians understand this. Now, as you'll appreciate, my explanation was a little long there.
No, but that's good actually, because we need to know. It's like, as you said, Canadians need to know what's the NATO role. And so it's like from your explanations, like NATO is just involved in militant operations only?
So good question. So no, it is both a military and a political organization. Mm-hmm. It's not like the generals of the different NATO nations. There are 29 of them now. Started off with just 12. But it's not like the generals get around and decide what to do. It's the politicians. So the ministers of foreign affairs, the ministers of defense are involved as well, but also the heads of state or government. So everybody gets around the table. And the one unique situation that NATO has is that it's not a majority vote. It's not a simple majority or even a large majority. It is consensus, which means that if you have, say, 12 people sitting around the table, all 12 have to agree on what to do, which is, I don't know if you've ever been to a restaurant and you've got to have 12 people pay for a bill. It's difficult to get people to agree on that, let alone international, events or actions. So it's really an amazing organization if you think about it that way.
Yeah. If you don't mind, it's like it just came to my mind now. So we always have, it's like different parties ruling the country, and each of them, it's like have their own vision how to tackle, it's like foreign issues. So how do you handle that? It's like as a NATO, it's like, it's like how do you deal with it?
It's a very good question. So every nation that is a part of NATO has both a government party and an opposition at any one time, depending on how the parliament or the Senate is made up. But NATO is a defensive organization. You may always think about it as something that you associate with war, but the bare minimum of what NATO is just defensive. Libya, you'll think, well, that seems pretty offensive. When NATO got involved in Libya, it was a bombing campaign, but that was strictly to eradicate the Libyan army's attempts to destroy and kill civilians. So it's almost always a deterrence or a defensive action that people are voting on. So even if different countries, governments and oppositions have different thoughts on where to go with a particular conflict around the world, NATO itself is always going back to the basics of deterrence and defense. So very few people can protest against that once they really look at the issues.
Okay, so why NATO's in Iraq?
Aha, so there you are, yet again. So I should have pointed out, defense in the world of NATO is all about the North Atlantic area. Which is kind of a hangover from the Second World War. The idea was that both North America, i.e. Canada and the United States, and then most of Europe, because that's most of European nations are members of NATO, those would be the territories which were protected by NATO. But over the past 20 years probably, there have been a number of different conflicts on the outlying areas of NATO, especially in the Mediterranean and in the Middle East. And then, of course, in Afghanistan after the September 11th attacks, where people have realized that actions by people who are outside of the North Atlantic area affect people who are inside it. This might seem kind of an insular view, but really what they're trying to do is to make sure that NATO helps solve problems before they come knocking at their door. So in that way, it is somewhat of a self-centered way to act, but the more that North Atlantic countries have been involved in international relations, the more they realize that if you provide security for one part of the world, it makes the entire world more secure. So for the Iraq situation, this is something that's called projecting security. What NATO really wants to do is to help the government in place in Iraq to maintain the security that they have. Obviously, the biggest loss of life and destruction that has happened since the American invasion has been because the central government cannot maintain any control over its territory. That created ISIS and many other splinter groups that have created untold havoc, death, and destruction. So the idea is to have a central authority, the Iraqi government, being able on its own to maintain security. NATO doesn't want to go in there and do it for the Iraqi government. It wants to help support the Iraqis in training their security forces so that they can do it on their own. As you'll appreciate, this has some anti-colonial kind of connection to it. So often in the 20th and even the 19th century, people thought of intervening, solving a problem for people, and then leaving. Well, NATO has realized that messes up a lot of things as well. So the idea is to try to help the government in place, in this case the Iraqi government, to maintain its own security before things get really bad. That's the idea anyways. It's got mixed successes so far, but then again, so has outright intervention, or in the case of Syria, not intervening at all. You know,
Okay.
so no option seems to be a good option. But this is what NATO is trying to do at the moment.
Okay, so according to the Canadian commander of NATO in Iraq, Major General Danny Fortin, he said that NATO will only be working with troops that are under the direct and effective control of the government of Iraq. So, as we all know, sectarian militias, which is known as Popular Mobilization Forces, played a crucial role in augmenting the Iraqi army. So how will NATO be able to screen out potential war criminals and hardcore militia members from being instructors in the troubled country rebuilt army?
So this is clearly a question that has plagued every intervention in the past 50 years, and probably longer than that. It's trying to find agents on the ground who are trustworthy and unlikely to utilize the skills and the different material that are given to them against either the government or any other member of a coalition once they have stopped being part of, in this case, the Iraqi army. It's a legitimate concern because it's happened in almost every conflict in the Middle East, where people come in, they train soldiers to work on their behalf because Western countries don't want to have their own soldiers die. So instead they hire proxies, arm them, train them, and then send them off to do a particular operation. And then after that, poof, who knows what happens to them.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert in this, but it's a common enough situation that NATO is well aware of the problems in training people, as is the Canadian Forces. So in this case, there are two levels of vetting that I know of. Again, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Canadian government here, but we are trusting to a certain degree our partners in the Iraqi government. So we are not picking who we are training from the entire Iraqi army. So the Iraqi army is picking the trainers that they present to us. From there, from what I understand from General Fortin's comments on this, then the Canadian Forces are vetting those people who have been picked. But the Canadian Forces aren't just going into the Iraqi army and picking people to train. They are looking at who the Iraqi government has put before them, and from there making an educated decision. I can't tell you what that process is, but I do know that these questions have been asked, and the Canadian Forces obviously are very alive to the possible problems that could happen down the line if they happen to have people in various militias, previous different rebels that you might not want to be associated with at all. So that it's a very real problem, and I think it's going to be a problem for a long time. It's just about mitigating the possibilities of that happening.
Okay, so we're going to deal with the Iraqi government, but as we know, it's like we have Kurdistan, they have their own government, their own military, and we have Iraq. So how are you going to deal with Kurdistan?
So that is a whole nother issue. The NATO mission itself is going to be based in Baghdad and then a couple of villages just outside it, from what I understand. And it'll be starting up right now. The general's putting together the whole outfit, and then I think in January the actual mission will start. But the Kurdistan area is one that Canada's been involved with, the United States has been involved with. Most Western countries who've been part of the different coalitions to eradicate ISIS have worked with Kurdistan because it has been an effective partner. But as far as how any government that's forming there will be treated in this situation, I am not privy to that information. But it's again, it's a very live issue. Right now, all I know is that the Canadian government is seeing Iraq as a single nation when it's dealing with it in a diplomatic sense, while at the same time recognizing that they have very long-standing ties locally with Kurdistan.
Okay. What kind of mission is Operation Impact?
It's a training mission. So the Canadian Forces are sending in 250 soldiers. Some of those will be for security, but most of those are going to be actually training instructors in the Iraqi army for things like armored vehicle maintenance, medical situations, infrastructure inspection, various things of this nature, so that it's really looking at a creation of strong best practices within the Iraqi army. Skills like this are not easy to come by. It takes a long time to develop them, and the Canadian Army has a lot of expertise in them. Since we've been in Afghanistan for so long, we've worked on the ground with these issues, and a lot of it is making sure that the Army itself has that feel of expertise about it, which is so important for any military.
Yeah. So why Canada has decided to join the mission?
Well, I think it's been a long time coming. The Canadian government has tried to find out how they can improve security in the area. Canada has a lot of diaspora who are from the Middle East. It has been in turmoil for so long now that to not act would really seem like, if not cowardice, then at least a certain blindness to the very real issues that are happening in the area. So the Canadian forces have been involved in many different operations with the coalition, usually in a training capacity. So that is really one of our best skills and certainly one of our best experiences in the Middle East. And what's trying to be achieved here is twofold. First of all, the expectation that the Middle East is worth saving. You know, that it must be helped in as many ways as possible, but empowered at the same time. So that's like the very first reason I think that the Canadian government is getting involved. But the second is that NATO, in the past few years, has had a growing sense of countries having to do more as part of their NATO membership. So every NATO country is supposed to reach a 2% threshold of defense spending as a percentage of their GDP, 2% on defense. Canada, in the past number of years, has not reached that. It's been hovering around 1%. This past year, it's increased to about 1.3%, so we are increasing our defense spending, but our friends to the south, the Americans, have pointed out that that's not good enough. Part of the Canadians' point of view, certainly the government of Canada has always suggested that defense spending is not the most important thing. We should also look at what militaries can do, what kind of missions they can go on, how much they help out. So for instance, Canada's been involved with every single NATO mission since the founding of the organization in 1949. So our volunteering to lead this NATO mission in Iraq is part of the explanation of why we shouldn't necessarily be expected to reach 2%, because we're helping in other ways. I should mention as well, the Iraqi mission is not the only mission Canada is part of at the moment. We are also in Latvia, in Northern Europe. So it's a good way for the Canadian government to show NATO and our allies how much we are helping out as part of the alliance, because this is not a small mission. It is 250 troops is a lot when you're looking at a training mission in the Middle East. It's one with a great deal riding on it. So those are the two main reasons that Canada is getting involved.
Okay, so what Canada is doing and contributing as part of the mission?
So in the training capacity, you're going to have about, we've got 250 troops going over there, so probably about 200 of them are actively going to be training, or maybe a little less than that. We're also offering security for the entire mission. I think altogether there's going to be about 500 troops. Turkey is our next largest ally who's helping out with the training mission. It's going to be a situation of setting up kind of the actual curriculum, what we're going to be teaching them. We're going to be taking a look at that for the next year And at that time, the Canadian government will be deciding whether they renew for another year or multiple years at that moment. So it's really just setting up the whole training regimen and making sure that we know what it is we're going to be teaching and how that curriculum is going to be expanded and work throughout the entire year.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and how does this mission connect with the many other missions in the region?
So, because of everything that's going on in the north with Syria, I'm talking about, of course, the continual mayhem with the current Assad regime, with Turkey pushing into the north, creating a kind of a buffer zone there, pockets of ISIS still popping up here and there. It's a very active area. Not only do we have the Assad regime in Turkey, we've got Russia, we've got Iran, the United States, of course. It is just a complex scenario. And the more people that you have involved in an area, the more likely it is that there's going to be a misunderstanding, that there's going to be a miscalculation. And that is a grave error. And one of the things that the NATO operation in Iraq is trying to maintain is, I think, distance from that area. People have thought, well, why doesn't NATO get involved in Syria?
Yeah,
and a number of organizations that have been involved with the coalition against ISIS have been strong NATO members. But the problem becomes when you put NATO right next to Russia, where there's operations with Russia. That becomes a real problem, and almost a situation too good to be true for Russia itself, as far as a tempting situation is concerned. So I think this NATO operation in Iraq is trying to be very much on the, that's one of the reasons it's on the training side of things, because it is low-key, it's capacity building, and it's trying to maintain security, not through combat roles, but in a non-combat role. So I think that's how this should be seen at the moment. And I mean, every person on earth, I think, is horrified by what's happening in Syria. And no less the NATO countries, but getting NATO involved in this case, I don't think would help in any way whatsoever. So,
Okay, you just mentioned Russia. Would you like to talk about how Russia and NATO are interacting, please?
Yes, certainly. So the fascinating thing about NATO is that it was created to help contain the Soviet Union, what would now be Russia. Yeah. But it was never, the Soviet Union was never mentioned in the NATO treaty. The idea of NATO is that anybody who attacks it will be considered as an enemy, or at least anybody who attacks NATO will be treated as an enemy by all of those who are members. So now that Russia is trying to create what might be called confusion, trouble, concern in most of Europe and North America, NATO is once again thrust in the position of being a bulwark or a wall against Russia, so that its reason for being is very clear, to make sure that our countries are safe from the scary Russians. And this plays right into Mr. Putin's hands, who may not represent his country's feelings on a citizen's level, but he's able to give them this sense of a resurgent Russia, which, of course, people always want to feel that their country is doing well, that they can be proud of who they are. Even if their individual situation is not the best, their country is something that's impressive and is strong. So Russia is doing everything it can to be shown as an impressive and strong counterpoint to NATO. So when Russia is getting involved in Syria, it's able to have a much larger impact against the United States, or be seen as a competitor with the United States in a clear, easily comparable situation. When it comes to Russia, NATO specifically, the situation is very clear in Ukraine and in Northern Europe as well, where Russia is trying to get most of the NATO nations concerned about cyber warfare and about creating questions in elections, meddling in elections. We've seen it in the United States of America even. And this has been a very effective way for Russia to show that they're still the big power that they all dream that they are. And this helps Mr. Putin very much. So NATO is trying to make sure that we are defending our nations, so most of Europe and North America, but at the same time not giving Russia any reason to be more belligerent than they already are. We don't want to kind of puff them up, as it were. It's a very tough balance, and I think by and large we've gotten it right so far, but it's a great challenge, because once you start doing something where you're responding to a potential threat from Russia, you're almost doing their work for them. So it's a very interesting situation at the moment, and I think we've got it right so far. Hopefully we can just maintain that.
Okay, going back to the NATO mission in Iraq. Turkey is a major force in the continued fighting in nearby Syria. Is Turkey the best partner for Canada in this mission?
So I'm not sure exactly how Turkey was chosen as one of the main partners in the mission in Iraq. We've always had, when I say we, the Canadian forces have always had a very close relationship with the Turkish military. But in this particular case, I think that Turkey has been doing a lot to try to make sure that the Western allies, and specifically NATO, know that it is still very much dedicated to the alliance. Turkey and the West, as we say, most of Europe and North America, we've had a very difficult past 2 or 3 years. I'd say especially since the attempted coup in July of 2016. The Turkish government had a very bad reaction to the lack of recognition from the rest of NATO specifically about the aftermath of the coup. I think that Erdogan specifically felt like a lot of his NATO allies might have been happy if the coup had succeeded. And that's a difficult diplomatic faux pas to make. It took several days for many different Western leaders to come to Turkey in the aftermath of the attempted coup. And this created a very bad, tense situation where because of this moment that really should have called for a lot of support, Turkey felt alone. And this only compounds the problem of the continued immigration from Syria. Now the Turkish government is holding about 3.5 million refugees on its soil. It's in a very difficult position. It's had a very permeable southern border. They've had a lot of terrorist attacks, so it's been in a vulnerable position, I'd say. However, on the other side, it has jailed hundreds of thousands of people in the aftermath of that attempted coup. That's including many, many journalists, a lot of members of NGOs, in the name of security. It's a difficult situation. Now, where our country bordering along a number of different countries that were in essentially a lawless state, we might be a little more sympathetic. But it's at the moment we are looking at Turkey in a very difficult light. The authoritarian tendencies of the Erdogan government have made things very, very difficult as far as dialogue is concerned. But my position has always been, from one that's purely one of observation, alliances are really important. When you've got a situation where lawlessness reigns right next door to this traditional ally, you have to try to shore up the security as much as possible. And if you can do that and have a conversation with them about perhaps loosening some of the security measures, making sure that they're a little less authoritarian, letting some of the jailed dissidents go, making sure that there are fair trials. It's much stronger to suggest these things from an alliance standpoint when you have a good relationship with them. That's not to apologize for Turkey, but NATO gives us that strength so that we can talk to them as partners and as equals. So having them involved in Iraq, I think, is probably a very good thing for our relationship, and it also shows how important they are in the area. They're one of the most strategic members of NATO. So my hope is that with the distant memory of the coup, it will get easier and easier to help the Turkish government ease up on some of its more draconian measures that it's put in place since the 2016 attempted coup. So, however, hope is not a good basis for policy, so I'm sure we'll still continue to talk frankly as friends that we need to make sure that the Turkish government is doing all that it can to give justice to its people.
Okay. What Canada can do in terms of rebuilding areas that were occupied by ISIS?
This is a very interesting point. I think I've said that a couple of times now, but I really like this question because Canada is something of an expert now at putting places back together. Our provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan in the mid to late 2000s and the early teens of this century, it was all about creating infrastructure, making sure that security provided for water, services, roads, bridges, the capability to maintain life. And so that the idea was if you win the hearts and minds of the locals, that they will rather choose to stay home, farm, live their life, than join a militia or become bandits. So that was the theory, and Canada got very good at reconstruction. In the Iraqi situation, the government wanted to maintain control of that. So, especially in this region, NATO is very conscious of the colonial implications of having an outside force from different countries come in and impose things, especially infrastructure, because it gives the idea that the local government can't do it on their own, that these people are somehow helpless. So I know that the decision was made that the Iraqi government is going to be dealing with most of the infrastructure. I'm not sure how that's going to happen, but I did hear from the Department of National Defense in one of their briefings that we will not be doing the same thing that we were doing in Afghanistan. Even though that we're really good at it, we're sticking with training. At the same time, I'm sure that there will be a lot of reconstruction going on, but I'm just not sure how it's going to happen.
Robert, it was a great pleasure having you with us today. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for being with us again.
Yeah, likewise. An absolute pleasure. I hope I can come back.
Sure.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and have a good night.